The Mill at Alder Brook. Episode 1. The Key Beneath the Millstone. The lane ran straight for half a mile before it began to curve alongside the alders. Tessa Vale had walked it twice before, once as a child on a school trip, and once on a damp Tuesday when she had driven past without stopping. Neither visit had prepared her for the late afternoon light in October, falling through leaves that were green at their centers and yellow at the edges. She carried a canvas rucksack and a small leather satchel. The satchel held a notebook, a pencil, a tin of tea, and a box of matches. The rucksack held clothes for the week and a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth. The bus had left her at the crossroads 3 miles back. There was no point bringing a car farther because the lane narrowed after the bridge and offered nowhere easy to turn. The walk had warmed her. The straps pressed comfortably against her shoulders, and the steady sound of Alder Brook moved somewhere beyond the trees to her left. She could not see the water yet, but she could hear its ordinary passage over stones and beneath low branches. At the next bend, the alders opened around a narrow wooden footbridge. Its single handrail had once been painted white and was now mostly gray. Beyond it lay a cobbled yard, and beyond the yard stood the mill. The building was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown into a different measure of it. It rose 2.5 stories in gray stone beneath a dark slate roof. Moss filled the shallow valleys between the roof pitches. On the brookside, a wooden water wheel rested against the wall, its buckets dark with moisture and completely still. The wheel stood in its own channel. Only a shallow film of water remained across the stones beneath it, too little to form a current. The fuller sound came from the natural brook beyond, where the water continued past the mill, without entering the wheel channel. Tessa crossed the footbridge and set her rucksack beside the bench near the door. The cobbles were smooth from old feet and cartwheels. An iron ring remained fixed to a wooden post near the wall, though there had been no horse tied there for a very long time. She had been told to arrive before 4. It was a little after 3, and John Bell had not yet come. She did not mind. The afternoon was warm for October, the bench was dry, and the mill gave her plenty to look at. A blackbird moved along the roof ridge. Beyond the eastern gable, an orchard spread across a gentle slope. The grass was long, and apples showed among the branches in muted red, green, and gold. 20 minutes later, footsteps sounded on the bridge. John Bell crossed into the yard wearing a tweed jacket over a woolen waistcoat. His hair was white and cut short, and his face looked lined more by weather than by worry. From one hand hung a small key on a leather thong. "Tessa," he said, as though they had spoken the day before. "You found it all right. The lane's easy enough to follow." He nodded and went to the oak door. The key turned heavily in the lock, and the bolt drew back with a solid sound. "The shutters open from inside," he said. "Main switch is downstairs in the wheel room. Kitchen's through the back. The water's on, and I filled the tank this morning." He held out the key. The leather thong was warm when she took it. "Anything I should avoid?" "The wheel," he said, glancing toward the side wall. "Though it won't trouble you. The sluice is closed and the race is drained. Leave all that as it is." "I will." He stepped inside with her while she set her bags on the long workbench beneath the windows. The main floor was dim, but not cold. It smelled of flour dust, old oak, and iron that had once been wet and had dried slowly. 2 great millstones occupied the center of the room. One rested above the other in a wooden frame, held slightly raised by iron rods and wooden wedges. Their gray surfaces were cut with deep radiating grooves. Along one wall stood 8 wooden bins, their lids closed and faded numbers painted on their fronts. A ladder rose to a trapdoor in the ceiling, while a narrow stone staircase led down. As John turned back toward the door, Tessa noticed a small wooden disc at the base of the millstone frame. It was partly caught beneath the edge, darkened with dust. She bent and eased it free. It was about the width of her palm, with a 7 burned into one face and a circle crossed by 2 straight lines carved on the other. John looked at it and gave a small nod. "Old sack marker," he said. "Number matched the bin. The mark on the back belonged to the mill. They kept the count straight when sacks were moving in and out, so it goes with bin 7. That's right. There used to be a crate of them in the loft." There was nothing secret in the object, only a practical purpose worn smooth by use. Tessa brushed away the dust and set it on the workbench beside her satchel. "I'll put it with the others if I find the crate." John nodded again. Then he crossed the yard and the footbridge and continued along the alder-lined lane until the bend hid him. Tessa returned to the doorway. The mill was hers to care for now, at least for the week. She stood at the threshold until her eyes adjusted fully, then began her first circuit. She opened the 4 main floor shutters, 2 facing the yard and 2 facing the orchard. Each iron latch lifted with a little resistance. As the shutters swung outward, bands of gold light crossed the oak floor and showed flower dust resting in the corners. She looked into each numbered bin without reaching inside. All 8 were empty, clean, and dry. The folded canvas sacks at the end of the workbench were soft with age but neatly stacked. Nothing on the main floor appeared disturbed. The millstones remained raised and still. She descended the stone stairs to the wheel room. The ceiling was low there, and the air held the cool dampness of stone close to water. Through an opening in the outer wall she could see the wheel, dark against the afternoon. Its main timber shaft passed into the room and met a series of wooden gears. Their teeth were worn smooth, fitted together, and motionless. The channel below held no moving water. A shallow puddle lay among the stones, no more than an inch deep. Beyond the wall, the natural brook continued on its separate course, and its quiet vibration could be felt through the floor. Beside the stairs stood the switchbox John had mentioned. Tessa opened its cover and found a row of fuses and a master switch labeled main in faded ink. There was light enough for her circuit, so she left it untouched. Back on the main floor, she raised the trapdoor and climbed into the grain loft. Warm air rested beneath the roof. Dark beams crossed overhead and long rectangles of light fell through the gable windows. Canvas sacks stood against the walls, some full and tied with twine, others empty and folded. A few carried pencil labels: wheat, rye, barley. Tessa counted them slowly. 23 full, 12 empty. She pressed one full sack lightly with her palm. The grain inside was settled and dry. She did not loosen any ties or open any canvas. At the far end, tucked between the last sack and the sloping wall, she saw the corner of a plain wooden crate. She drew it just far enough into the light to lift its loose lid. More wooden markers lay inside on a bed of old straw, their numbered faces visible. She fetched the marker from the workbench, returned to the loft, and placed number 7 with the others. It settled with a soft wooden knock. Then she replaced the lid and moved the crate back into its sheltered corner. The small matter was complete. From the orchard-side window, she could see the narrow mill race leading upstream. Its lined bed lay pale and empty. Farther away, the natural brook caught the light as it moved past the closed sluice. The 2 courses were easy to distinguish, one flowing freely through the meadow, the other drained and waiting beside the mill. Tessa closed the crate, counted the sacks once more in her head, and climbed down. The kitchen lay beyond the main floor. It was a small room with a stone floor, a wooden table, a cast-iron stove, and a sink with one tap. A kettle waited on the stove. The cupboards held a few plates, bowls, cups, and a knife. John's tin of tea sat on the shelf, though she had brought her own. She turned the tap. The water ran cold and clear. Beside the stove was a box of kindling and several beech logs, enough for the evening. A door beyond the kitchen opened into a little scullery, and then the kitchen garden. Tessa stepped outside. Rosemary, thyme, and sage remained visible among the weeds, and a few late flowers had gone to seed. Beyond the low bed stood the bakehouse. Its door was ajar. Inside, a brick oven filled the far wall, its iron door closed. A wooden peel leaned nearby, and a long table occupied the center of the room. Its surface had been scrubbed pale, with a shallow depression worn by years of kneading. The room smelled faintly of ash and flour. Tessa did not touch the oven. She simply included the table, shelves, peel, and door in her growing map. From the bakehouse she followed the path into the orchard. There were perhaps 30 trees, some old and bent, others younger and straighter. Long grass brushed her boots. Windfall apples lay beneath the branches in scattered drifts. She picked up one small red apple. Its skin was unbroken, and it smelled clean and sweet, so she slipped it into her pocket. At the far end of the orchard, the ground opened into the sluice meadow. The dry mill race followed its edge lined with stone. A narrow path ran beside it, toward the wooden sluice gate upstream. Tessa walked only far enough to see the gate clearly. Its iron handle was down, and the gate remained closed. Water passed through the natural brook instead, moving around the ordinary stones and continuing beside the mill. She did not touch the handle. She had confirmed what John had told her. The sluice was closed, the supply race was drained, and the wheel had no water passing through it. From the meadow she looked back. The mill stood with its shutters open to the last of the afternoon. The wheel rested against the side wall. Beyond the kitchen garden were the bakehouse and orchard. Within the mill were the kitchen, main floor, wheel room, and loft. The lane and footbridge returned from the yard toward the road. The geography had become simple in her mind, each place joined to the next. She retraced her steps through the orchard and kitchen garden. Inside, she placed her rucksack near the loft ladder and carried the bread into the kitchen. Then she laid kindling in the stove, struck a match, and waited until the thin wood caught before adding one small log. While the kettle heated, she opened her notebook at the kitchen table. She wrote the date, then made a plain evening record. Arrived at 3:30, John Bell gave me the key. Shutters opened. Main floor, wheel room, loft, kitchen, scullery, bakehouse, kitchen garden, orchard, mill race, and sluice meadow checked. Wheel stationary, sluice closed, supply race drained. Natural brook flowing past the mill. 8 bins empty and dry. 23 full sacks and 12 empty sacks in loft. Water clear. Stove lit. Below that, she added, wooden disc found beneath millstone frame. John identified it as an old sack marker for bin 7. Returned it to the marker crate in the loft. She read the entry once. It was enough for an evening log. Arrival time, rooms checked, water state, grain count, stove, and anything moved. She could use the same order on the evenings ahead. The kettle began to murmur. Tessa spooned tea into the chipped enamel cup, poured in the hot water, and carried it to the table. She set the red apple beside her notebook and left it whole for morning. Outside the kitchen window, the orchard was growing dim. A band of orange remained below the deepening blue of the sky. The stove gave off a mild warmth, and the brook continued beyond the wall with its steady, unhurried sound. Tessa held the cup in both hands. The key lay safely beside the notebook. The old marker was back with the others. The sacks had been counted, the bins checked, the rooms opened, and the route to the sluice understood. Nothing had been left unexplained, and nothing in the mill required movement tonight. She drank her tea slowly while the wheel rested beside the moving brook. When the cup was empty, she would close the shutters in the same order she had opened them, check the stove, and leave the notebook ready for the next round. The first circuit was complete, and the mill now had a simple evening routine. Tessa left the empty cup on the draining board and stood for a moment with one hand resting on the edge of the sink. The kitchen had grown warmer while she drank her tea. A mild heat came from the cast-iron stove, carrying the dry scent of beech smoke, and the stone floor no longer felt quite so cool beneath her boots. Outside the window, the orchard had lost most of its color. The apples beneath the trees were dim red and green shapes in the long grass. Above them, the last orange light had narrowed to a thin band beyond the alders. Her first circuit of the mill was complete. She knew where each room led, where the lane crossed the footbridge, and how the kitchen garden opened toward the bakehouse and orchard. She knew that the narrow path beyond the orchard followed the drained mill race upstream to the sluice meadow. She knew the gate was closed, the wheel was still, and the natural brook continued on its own course beside the mill. There was another round she would need before the evening ended. The ordinary work of closing the place for the night. It was not time for that yet. The mill still held the last of the daylight through its open shutters and windows. The oak door stood open to the yard, and the garden door remained open beyond the scullery. Tessa wanted to establish the order now, while she could consider it without hurry, then leave the actual closing until the final round. She returned to the table and opened her notebook. Beneath the evening record, she drew a short line and wrote a second heading, closing round. She considered the rooms she had visited and put them into an order that would save her from going back and forth. Bakehouse door, garden door, stove, main floor bins and workbench, wheel room, loft windows, main shutters, oak door. It was a prospective list rather than a record of completed work. Tomorrow she could follow it again, adding or removing a step if the mill showed her a better way. Tessa added one more line beneath it. Check once in this order before closing tonight. She slipped the pencil into the fold of the notebook and left the book open on the table. Then she took the box of matches from her satchel and lit the small lamp on the kitchen shelf. The wick caught with a low flame. She adjusted it until the glass held an even amber light, bright enough to carry without throwing hard shadows across the room. With the lamp in one hand, she crossed the scullery and stepped through the open outer door. The evening air felt cool after the kitchen. Rosemary and damp soil scented the garden, and somewhere in the orchard a blackbird gave one last brief call before becoming quiet. Tessa followed the path to the bakehouse. Its door was still ajar, just as she had found it. She pushed it open a little farther and raised the lamp. The brick oven stood dark at the far wall, its iron door closed. The wooden peel remained propped beside it. The long table was bare, and the shelves held only the bowls she had already seen. Nothing had been lit, moved, or left in need of attention. Beside the door, the plain wooden bar rested ready for the final closing round. Tessa lifted it once to feel its weight, and fitted one end briefly into the iron catch. The movement was simple. When the time came, she would draw the door shut, settle the bar into place, and test it once. For now she removed the bar and returned it to its resting position. She left the bakehouse door ajar as it had been. On the walk back, the lamp showed a small circle of thyme, sage, weeds, and pale stones. Beyond that circle, the garden rested in blue dusk. There was no need to inspect the orchard again. She had walked it once, seen the windfall apples and the path into the meadow, and confirmed the closed sluice from a respectful distance. At the scullery, she examined the garden door without closing it. Its key was already in the lock. The bolt moved cleanly when she turned the key partway, so she returned it to the open position. Later, after the last outside circuit, the door could be drawn in, locked, and tested. She stepped back into the kitchen, leaving the garden door open behind her. The stove had burned down from flame to a steady bed of red embers around the small log. Tessa did not add more wood. She adjusted the dampers slightly and watched until the embers remained calm and even. For the final round, the kettle could be moved from the hot plate to the cooler iron. The tea tin would be closed, the matches kept dry, and the cup left rinsed on the draining board. Those small kitchen states were already clear enough that she did not need to write them separately. She picked up the lamp and moved into the main room. The millstones occupied the center of the floor, large and quiet in the amber light. Their radiating grooves caught narrow lines of shadow. The upper stone remained slightly raised in its wooden frame, held by the same rods and wedges she had examined earlier. Nothing about it had changed. Along the wall, the 8 bins stood with their lids closed. Tessa did not open them again. She passed a hand lightly over each lid, confirming that it had settled flat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. At number 7, she remembered the wooden marker she had found beneath the millstone frame. It was no longer on the workbench. John had identified it before he left, and Tessa had already carried it upstairs and returned it to the plain crate with the other markers. The small matter had begun and ended within the same afternoon. The token belonged to an ordinary counting system, and it was back where it belonged. At the workbench, the folded canvas sacks remained in their neat stack. Her rucksack stood near the loft ladder. The satchel was in the kitchen, beside the notebook. The mill key lay on its leather thong near the open page, where she would see it before the final round began. Tessa looked toward the 4 open shutters. Their latches were simple and all within reach. She could close the 2 orchard side shutters first, cross the room and close the 2 facing the yard. The oak door would remain until last, allowing her one final look outside before she locked it. She left every shutter open. Then she crossed to the stone stairs and descended into the wheel room. The lamp made the room appear lower than it had in daylight. Its glow reached the main timber shaft, the nearest gear, and part of the iron brackets fixed into the wall. Beyond them, the rest settled into soft shadow. She held the lamp away from the wood and stood on the last stair. The mechanism remained completely still. Wooden teeth rested between wooden teeth. The massive shaft carried no movement from the wheel outside, and no tremor passed through the frame. The only vibration came faintly through the stone floor from the natural brook beyond the wall. Tessa looked down into the wheel channel. A shallow film of water remained among the stones, no more than she had seen before. It had no current. The supply race leading from the closed sluice was drained, and no water entered the wheel. She went to the switch box beside the stairs and lifted its cover. The master switch still stood where she had left it. She had managed with daylight and the lamp, so there was nothing electrical to turn off. She closed the cover until its small catch clicked. For a few breaths she listened to the 2 kinds of quiet in the room. There was the stillness of the mechanism, deliberate and complete. Beneath it was the soft passage of the brook outside, moving steadily along its natural bed. One rested, the other continued. The distinction was clear. The mechanism needed no further investigation. The wheel was stationary, the switch was untouched, and the shallow water in the channel had no current. Still, the wheel room would remain in the written closing order. Tessa would descend once during the final round, not to investigate anything new, but simply to confirm that its state had remained unchanged before she closed the mill for the night. Tessa climbed back to the main floor and paused beside the ladder. The loft was the one place that needed a little preparation before the final round. Its windows could remain open until later, but the cot beneath the roof slope was not yet ready. She set the lamp on the workbench, raised the trapdoor, and climbed with both hands free. When she reached the top, she lifted the lamp through after her. Warmth from the day still rested beneath the slate roof. The 23 full sacks stood against the walls, their tied necks leaning at slightly different angles. The 12 empty sacks remained folded apart from them. Nothing had shifted since her count. The marker crate was tucked between the last sack and the sloping wall. Tessa did not draw it out or lift its lid. She could picture the wooden number 7, lying with the other old markers, its mill mark turned toward the straw or toward another token. Its exact position did not matter. It had been identified and returned. A narrow cot stood beneath one roof slope, with a folded blanket at its foot. Tessa had noticed it during her first circuit, but had not yet prepared it. She set the lamp on the floor well away from the blanket. Then she lifted the folded wool and shook it out once. A faint scent of cedar and dry storage rose from it. The blanket was plain brown, lighter at the creases where it had been protected from dust. Tessa spread it across the cot, smoothed it from the head toward the foot, and folded back one corner. The mattress beneath was narrow but even. She pressed it once with her palm. It gave gently and returned to shape. A flat pillow rested against the wall, its linen cover clean and cool. Tessa lifted it, gave it one small shake, and set it back. Her rucksack could remain below until she was ready to bring up what she needed. There was no reason to unpack everything. The cot, blanket, and pillow were enough to give the night a prepared place without ending the evening before its proper time. Tessa went to the orchard-side gable window. It remained open. Cool air passed through it, carrying the faint sweetness of apples and long grass. The latch moved easily when she touched it, and the frame drew inward without resistance. She let it rest back in its open position. At the opposite gable, she did the same with the window facing the lane. Through it, the pale curve of the road could still be made out between the alders. Below the roofline, the yard and footbridge lay in deepening shade. When the final round came, she would close the orchard window first and the lane window second. For now both remained open, allowing the loft to keep the last of the evening air. Tessa carried the lamp back to the ladder and climbed down. She lowered the trapdoor gently rather than letting it fall. It met the frame with a wooden sound and settled flush with the ceiling. The main floor remained open around her. Fading light entered through all 4 windows. The oak entrance still stood open toward the cobbled yard. From where Tessa stood, she could see the empty bench, the old post with its iron ring, and part of the gray footbridge rail. She walked once around the millstone frame, keeping enough distance that her sleeve did not brush the wood. She checked the workbench, the folded sacks, the closed bins, the stone stairs, and the lowered loft door. Everything had a place. Everything she had opened was still open by choice, or ready to be closed later in the order she had written. Tessa stepped through the oak doorway into the yard. The cooler air touched her face. Nothing remained on the bench. The footbridge rested beyond the cobbles, and the alder-lined lane had begun to fade into dusk. She rested her hand briefly on the edge of the heavy door. It moved smoothly enough on its hinges. The old lock would resist at the first fraction of a turn, as it had when John opened it, but the key was ready on the kitchen table. The oak door would be last. Tessa left it open. She carried the lamp back through the main room and into the kitchen. The room received her with the mild warmth of the stove. Through the open scullery came a narrow thread of cool garden air, scented with rosemary and damp earth. She set the lamp beside the notebook and sat. Beneath the prospective closing list, she added a few notes. Bakehouse bar fits. Garden door lock moves freely. Stove low. Bins and workbench clear. Wheel and gears stationary. Switch untouched. No further mechanism investigation needed. Confirm unchanged state during final closing round. Cot prepared. Loft window latches sound. Main shutters and oak door to remain open until final round. After that she wrote, "Closing order should work." She read the page from the beginning. It held the arrival time, the rooms, the water state, the sack count, the stove, the old marker and its explanation, and now the shape of the later closing round. Nothing depended on memory alone. The mill had not been closed too soon. The bakehouse remained ajar. The garden door, main shutters, loft windows, and oak door remained open. The stove continued at a low, steady warmth. The wheel had been confirmed and required no further investigation. Its one remaining place in the evening was the ordinary final confirmation already written into the closing order. Above, the cot waited with its blanket spread and one corner folded back. Tessa set the pencil across the open notebook without closing the cover. The mill key remained beside it in its loose circle of leather. The golden edge of the lamp flame moved once beneath the glass and settled again. She lifted the kettle from the cooler iron and judged its weight. There was enough water for another cup if she wanted one later. She returned it to the stove without moving it onto the hottest plate. For a little while she listened. The stove gave a soft tick. Air moved faintly through the scullery. Alder Brook continued beyond the wall with its steady, ordinary voice. The wheel made no sound at all. Her first circuit had shown her the mill in daylight. This smaller round had given the final closure a dependable shape without completing it before its time. When the evening reached its proper end, she could follow the list plainly: bakehouse, garden door, stove, main floor, wheel room, loft windows, shutters, and oak door. In the wheel room, she would need only to stand on the landing, with the lamp held clear of the timber, and confirm what she already knew. The shaft would remain at rest in its brackets. The wooden teeth would remain fitted together without movement. The switch would remain untouched, and the shallow water in the channel would remain still. Once those unchanged states were seen, she could climb back upstairs and continue through the rest of the list. Until then, the mill could remain open around her. Tessa rested both hands on the warm wooden table. The notebook and key were ready. The cot was prepared. The stationary wheel had been confirmed, and nothing in the mechanism had been touched or left uncertain. Behind her, the kitchen stayed open to the cool scullery and the darkening garden. Beyond the doorway, the main floor still held the last soft light from its open shutters. The final round waited in a clear and settled order. It would return her once to the quiet wheel room, then carry her upward to the loft windows, across the main floor to the shutters, and at last to the oak door. Tessa remained calmly in the kitchen, with that order written down, and the final closure waiting for later. Tessa remained at the kitchen table, with the prospective closing round open before her. The lamp stood beside the notebook, though there was still enough evening light to see without it. Through the doorway to the main floor, the 4 open shutters admitted long, amber shapes across the oak boards. Cool air moved in from the garden through the scullery, carrying rosemary, damp soil, and the faint sweetness of the orchard. The stove held a low, steady warmth. The kettle rested on the cooler iron. Beside the notebook lay the mill key, its leather thong arranged in a loose circle where Tessa had placed it. Nothing needed to be closed yet. She read the final line she had written. Closing order should work. The words were plain and sufficient. Bakehouse, garden door, stove, main floor, wheel room, loft windows, shutters, oak door. When the last of the light had gone, she could follow that path once and leave every part of the mill settled for the night. For now, the building remained open around her. Tessa lifted the lamp and carried it into the main room. She set it on the workbench, well away from the folded canvas sacks, then stood beneath the loft ladder. There was one small thing she wanted to confirm before turning to quieter work. John had already explained the wooden disc she had found beneath the millstone frame. It was an old sack marker. The 7 matched bin 7, and the crossed circle on the reverse belonged to the mill. Tessa had returned it to the crate in the loft during her first circuit. The matter was already understood. Still, when she had opened the crate, she had noticed the edges of other numbered markers resting in the straw. She wanted one brief look at the set, enough to fix John's explanation in her mind before she left the box alone. She raised the trapdoor and climbed. Warm air remained beneath the roof. It carried the dry scents of canvas, timber, and settled grain. Both gable windows stood open as she had left them, and the fading light entered from opposite ends of the loft. The cot waited beneath the roof slope, with its brown blanket spread smoothly across it. One corner remained folded back. The flat pillow rested against the wall. Nothing there needed attention. Tessa walked to the far end of the loft. The full sack stood tied and undisturbed along the wall. The empty canvas remained folded apart. She did not count either group again. Their numbers were already written in the notebook, and nothing had happened that could have changed them. The marker crate rested between the last sack and the sloping timber. Its plain lid sat loosely over the top. Tessa drew the box a little way into the light and knelt beside it. When she lifted the lid, one wooden marker touched another with a soft knock. The discs lay on their bed of old straw. A 2 showed near the front. A 5 rested partly on its edge. Number 7 lay beneath the rim of another marker, exactly where it had settled when Tessa returned it. She picked it up. The pale wood had darkened around the edges from years of handling. The burned numeral remained clear. On the reverse, the crossed circle was shallow but easy to recognize. John's explanation needed nothing added to it. The number connected the marker to the matching bin. The mark showed that the disc belonged here at the mill. It was a small reusable label, made to keep an ordinary exchange in order. Tessa turned over the marker beside it. Number 8 carried the same crossed circle. So did number 5. Each mark differed slightly, because it had been cut by hand, but the design remained the same. As she replaced the 5th marker, she noticed the corner of a folded paper resting against the inner side of the crate. It was not hidden. The loose straw had simply shifted around it, leaving one yellowed edge in view. Tessa drew the paper out and opened it carefully across the lid. The pencil writing had faded, but only 2 short instructions remained necessary to read. Sack markers belong with the numbered bins. Return each marker to the box when the sack comes back empty. Below them in smaller writing was a final note. Crossed circle, Bell and Son, Alder Brook. Tessa read the lines once. They confirmed what John had told her. The number belonged with the bin. The crossed circle belonged to the mill, and the marker returned to the crate when its small piece of work was over. There was no further question in it. She folded the paper along its old creases and placed it against the inner wall of the crate, above the straw where the next person could find it without moving the markers. Then she returned number 7 to the others and lowered the lid. The small discovery was complete almost as soon as it had begun. Tessa remained kneeling. For a moment, one hand resting lightly on the top of the box. The crate was not a place of secrets. The folded paper had not been left as a message for her. They were working things kept together for the convenience of whoever next needed them. That plainness suited the mill. A wooden marker could stray beneath a frame. Someone could find it, recognize its number, and put it back. If an explanation was needed, the note remained with the box. Once the object had returned to its place, the matter ended. Tessa pushed the crate into its sheltered position beneath the sloping roof. She brushed a few pieces of straw dust from her fingertips and stood. At the orchard-side gable window, the evening had deepened but not yet darkened. The kitchen garden lay below, its paths between the herb beds. Beyond the bakehouse, orchard branches spread over the long grass. Apples showed among the leaves in softened red, green, and gold. Farther on, the edge of the sluice meadow rested beneath the lowering light. A section of the drained mill race could be seen between the grass and the wall. Its exposed stones were pale and dry. Beyond it, Alder Brook continued along its natural course. No water turned toward the mill. Tessa rested both hands on the sill. From the loft, the brook sounded quieter than it did in the yard. Stone, timber, and distance softened the separate movements of water into one even passage. It rose slightly where the brook crossed shallow stones and eased again beneath the alders. The wheel gave no sound at all. Cool air entered through the open window and passed across Tessa's hands. Behind her, the loft held the day's remaining warmth. The two temperatures met gently beneath the roof without disturbing the sacks, the cot, or the closed marker crate. She stayed there for a little while. Nothing in the view required her to go out again. She had already seen the orchard, the drained race, and the closed sluice. The path beside the meadow was known. The wheelroom had been checked, and the mechanism rested completely still. The evening could narrow now. The marker was understood. The crate was closed. The paper had been returned. When Tessa left the window, she did not look inside the box again. She crossed the loft at an easy pace, lowered herself onto the ladder, and climbed down to the main floor. The lamp remained on the workbench. Its amber flame was growing more visible as the daylight softened. Beside it, a stack of folded canvas sacks rested unchanged. Tessa blinked 7. She did not lift the lid. She had already confirmed that all 8 bins were empty, clean and dry. Instead, she placed her fingertips against the faded painted number on the front. 7 on the bin. 7 on the marker. The same simple connection John had described. She let her hand fall and moved away. Tessa opened the notebook beneath the lines about the closing round. She added one brief entry. Marker note confirms John's explanation. Numbers match the bins. Crossed circle is the Bell and Son mill mark. Number 7 returned to the crate. She read it once, closed the notebook, and carried it back to the kitchen. The entry needed no longer a count. She had not put the system to use, moved any sack, or opened any bin. She had only read the note and returned it to the place where it belonged. Tessa set the notebook beside the key. The kettle still held enough water for another cup, but she did not make tea yet. She went through the scullery and paused at the open garden door. Evening air moved over the stone threshold. Rosemary stood nearest the path, with thyme spreading low beside it, and broad sage leaves farther along the bed. The bakehouse door remained ajar, as it had been during her first circuit. Its wooden bar waited beside the frame for the final closing round. She stepped outside and walked only as far as the first herb bed. A fallen alder leaf lay across one of the path stones. Tessa bent, picked it up by the stem, and placed it on the dark soil beside the rosemary. The leaf settled there with its yellow side uppermost. She did not continue to the bakehouse or orchard. Those places were already part of her map. There would be time to learn their working order more carefully before the light ended. Without turning the marker's explanation into the beginning of another large circuit. For the moment, she stood beside the herbs and listened. From here the brook sounded clearer. Water passed beyond the mill wall, steady and separate from the drained channel beneath the wheel. A slight breeze moved through the orchard leaves. Somewhere near the roof, the blackbird shifted once and then became quiet again. Tessa rubbed a rosemary leaf gently between her fingers. Its clean scent remained on her skin. Then she returned through the scullery. In the kitchen, the stove had settled around the small beech log. No flame showed when she looked through the firebox opening, only a mild red glow, and the occasional quiet movement of ash. The kettle waited on the cooler iron. Tessa filled her cup with the water that remained warm, added a little tea, and carried it to the table. She sat with the notebook and key before her. The light moved slowly across the stone floor. A narrow amber band touched one table leg, then withdrew as the sun lowered behind the alders. The lamp's glow replaced it without any sudden change. Tessa held the cup between both hands. The mill had several small forms of order, and she did not need to learn all of them in one evening. Some were already clear. The key belonged beside the notebook when it was not in her hand. The lamp belonged where its light could be carried safely. The shutters and windows remained open until the closing round. The stove was kept low. The sluice stayed closed, the race stayed drained, and the wheel remained still. The marker had its own equally modest place. A number matched a bin. The crossed circle named the mill. When the marker's use was finished, it returned to the crate. Tessa drank her tea slowly. The cup warmed her palms. Rosemary lingered faintly on her fingers beneath the scent of the tea. Nothing about the discovery had altered the mill. It had not created a new task, or changed the order of the evening. It had only confirmed that one worn object belonged to the same practical rhythm as everything around it. When the cup was empty, she rinsed it and set it upside down on the draining board. The mill remained open. Air still passed through the main floor shutters and the two gable windows above. The oak door stood open toward the cobbled yard. The garden door remained open through the scullery. The bakehouse door was still ajar, waiting to be secured when the closing round began. There was enough light left for a little gentle work before then. Tessa stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main floor. The lamp behind her gave the wood a mild amber edge. Ahead, the last daylight lay across the closed bins and the raised millstones. Fine flour dust showed along the wall beneath the workbench and in the shallow seams of the oak floor. The broom hung from its pegs beside the kitchen door. A wooden-edged dustpan rested below it. Tessa looked at the clear boards, the settled bins, and the quiet frame around the stones. The marker was back in its crate. The note was folded above the straw. The explanation was entered in the notebook. Nothing about it needed another inspection. She left the notebook and key together on the kitchen table and reached for the broom. The mill remained open to the evening, ready for one small unhurried piece of work before the familiar closing round. The mill remained open to the evening. Tessa stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main floor, one hand resting against the warm wooden frame. Behind her, the notebook and mill key lay together on the kitchen table. Above, both loft windows were open. The four main floor shutters stood wide, and the oak door admitted a long shape of amber light from the yard. The small discovery in the marker crate was complete. Number 7 was back with the other sack markers. The folded instruction rested above the straw. Each numbered marker corresponded to a bin and carried the Bell and Son mill mark. When its sack came back empty, the marker returned to the crate. Tessa had entered the same plain explanation in her notebook. Marker note confirms John's explanation. Numbers match the bins. Crossed circle is the Bell and Son mill mark. Number 7 returned to the crate. Nothing about it needed another thought. There was still light enough for a modest round, and Tessa knew what she wanted from it. She had already passed through the rooms beyond the kitchen as part of her first broad circuit. Now she could learn that quieter side of the mill more carefully. The kitchen, the scullery, the garden, the bakehouse, and the beginning of the orchard path. Not to clean the rooms or prepare them for work, only to notice their order and understand how one place led to the next. Before going outside, she looked down at the main floorboards. Fine flour dust lay along the wall and beneath the workbench. It had gathered in the seams around the feet of the empty bins and in a pale curve near the millstone frame. The dust wasn't troublesome. It was simply what remained when a working room had rested for a while. A broom hung from 2 pegs beside the kitchen door. Its handle was smooth from use, and the bristles were worn shorter on one side. A shallow wooden-edged dustpan stood beneath it. Tessa reached toward the broom, then let her hand rest at her side. Sweeping the main floor would be easy enough, but it would also turn this quiet orientation into another task. The dust could remain until a later round. It did not block the floor, threaten the grain, or require attention before night. The broom and pan were where she would expect to find them when they were needed. That was enough to know. She left them on their pegs. The 8 bin lids remained closed. The millstone stayed raised and still. Nothing lay beneath the frame now that the old marker had been returned to its crate. The clear walking space between the kitchen, workbench, bins, stairs, and oak door was easy to follow without moving anything. Tessa stepped back into the kitchen. The room had a simple center. The table stood within easy reach of the stove and sink. The kettle could pass from the tap to the iron, without being carried across the room. The tea tin and matches belonged on the shelf above. Cups, plates, bowls, and the kitchen knife occupied the cupboards nearest the table. The stove held one small beech log, settled to a mild red glow behind the firebox door. Tessa added no more wood. The kettle already rested on the cooler part of the iron, and the damper remained where she had set it. Beside the stove, the kindling box was nearly full. The beech logs were stacked with their cut ends facing outward. The ash bucket stood nearby. Nothing blocked the space around the stove, and nothing needed rearranging. At the sink, the tap was fully closed. Her rinsed cup rested upside down on the draining board. Tessa stood in the middle of the room and looked from one useful place to the next. Table, stove, sink, cupboard, shelf. The order was ordinary and easy to remember. Tea could be made without crossing the room twice. Bread could be cut at the table, and the knife returned to the cupboard. Water, fire, and dishes each had their own small area. She didn't open the cupboards again. She had already seen what they held. She didn't wipe the table or lift the stove lid. This was only a second, quieter look at a room she would use each evening. Cool air reached her through the scullery. Tessa followed it. The scullery was narrower than the kitchen and cooler underfoot. A stone shelf ran along one wall. Beneath it stood two buckets, one nested inside the other, and a low wooden crate held folded cloths. 3 hooks had been fixed beside the garden door. One held a plain canvas apron. The other 2 were empty. There was no need to move any of these things. Buckets below the shelf, cloths in the crate, apron beside the outside door. The scullery made a small passage between indoor work and outdoor work, and its objects suited that purpose. Muddy boots could pause on the stone. A bucket could be carried into the garden without passing around the kitchen table. A damp cloth could hang near the moving air. The garden door stood open, as it had since her first circuit. Tessa stepped across the threshold. Rosemary and thyme scented the cooler air. The path stones were dry on their upper surfaces, but still dark at the edges where the lowering sun had not reached them. Sage grew in a pale, broad cluster near the wall. A few late flowers had gone to seed among the weeds. The garden didn't need tending. Its paths remained clear enough, and the herbs were easy to recognize. Rosemary stood nearest the mill. Thyme spread low beside the stones. Sage occupied the broader patch beyond. Tessa walked slowly along the path, keeping her hands at her sides. She did not pull the weeds or gather the herbs. Those small acts could wait until there was a reason for them. For now, the plants marked the route as plainly as any sign. Past the beds, the path divided gently. One short branch led to the bakehouse door. The other passed around the bakehouse wall and continued toward the orchard. Tessa took the shorter branch. The bakehouse door remained ajar, just as it had during her first circuit, and her earlier look at the wooden bar. She put one hand against the outer edge, and opened it only far enough to enter without brushing the frame. Cool, dry air met her. The brick oven filled the far wall. Its iron door was closed, and no warmth came from it. The wooden peel leaned nearby. Bowls stood nested on the shelves, and the long pale table occupied the center of the room. Tessa remained near the doorway at first. The room's working order was visible without touching anything. Bowls belonged on the wall shelves. The table provided space for mixing and kneading. The peel stood within reach of the oven. The wooden bar waited beside the door for the closing round. She walked once around the table. Its shallow kneading hollow caught a little light from the open doorway. The worn place showed where hands and dough had returned over many years, but the table required nothing from her now. There was no flour to mix, no dough to shape, and no fire to lay. Tessa did not open the oven. She did not lift the bowls or look beneath the table. She did not sweep the floor, wipe the wood, or begin arranging the room for baking. Those belonged to another day, when the bakehouse itself would be the evening's work. Tonight she needed only the broad arrangement. Shelves along the wall, table at the center, peel beside the oven, bar beside the door. The oven remained cold and closed. The room remained dry. The doorway opened directly toward the herb beds, while the path around the outer wall led to the orchard. That was enough. Tessa stepped outside and returned the door to its earlier ajar position. She left the wooden bar where it was. The bakehouse would be secured during the final closing round, in the order already written in her notebook. Nothing needed to be closed before its time. She followed the path around the low bakehouse wall. Dry lavender heads leaned over one edge, carrying only the faintest scent when the air moved. Beyond them, the orchard opened across the gentle slope. Tessa walked only as far as the first row of trees. Long grass moved around her boots. Windfall apples lay beneath the branches in quiet drifts of red, green, and muted gold. Some were whole and firm. Others had softened where they fell. She left them all in place. There were older trees with low, bent limbs and younger trees with straighter trunks. The broad path followed the orchard edge beside a low stone wall. Farther on, it led toward the small wooden gate opening into the sluice meadow. The drained mill race lay beyond that wall, though from where she stood only a pale section could be seen between the grasses. Tessa didn't go to the gate. She had already seen the sluice during her first circuit. Its iron handle was down. The gate was closed. Water continued through the natural brook, and the supply race remained drained. Nothing in that state required another inspection during this gentle round. Instead, she looked back toward the mill. From the first row, the route was plain. Orchard to bakehouse to herb beds to scullery to kitchen. Beyond the kitchen lay the main floor, with the wheelroom below and the loft above. The orchard was not separate from the mill's daily round. It was simply the farthest quiet room, open to the weather and roofed by branches. A breeze moved through the leaves. One apple shifted in the grass where a long blade had been holding it, then settled again. Beyond the stone wall, Alder Brook continued along its natural bed. The stronger sound of water came from there, not from the drained race. The wheel remained still. Tessa stayed at the edge of the orchard for a little while without looking for anything more. The grass leaned and rose. Leaves moved against one another. Water passed beyond the wall. No task announced itself. The windfall apples could remain beneath the trees. The path did not need clearing. The low branches did not need lifting or tying back. This evening was for knowing the place, not improving it. When Tessa turned, she followed the same short route toward the garden. At the bakehouse, she checked the door by sight. It remained ajar. The wooden bar still waited beside the frame. She did not enter again. The lavender heads moved slightly as she passed. In the garden, one fallen alder leaf lay across a path stone. Tessa stepped around it rather than brushing it aside. The herbs, seed heads, weeds, and fallen leaf could all remain as they were. The path was still open and easy to follow. She paused beside the rosemary and drew one breath of its clean scent. Then she returned through the garden door. The scullery received the cooler air behind her. The nested buckets remained beneath the stone shelf. The folded cloths rested in their crate. The canvas apron hung quietly from its hook. Tessa passed through without taking down the apron or unfolding a cloth. In the kitchen, the stove held the same low warmth. The kettle remained on the cooler iron. Her notebook lay beside the key. She sat at the table and opened it beneath the lines about the marker system. For a moment she considered how much to write. The round had not changed any object or completed any preparation. Its purpose had been orientation, and the record could be equally light. She wrote, "Quiet route beyond kitchen now clear, scullery, buckets below stone shelf, cloths in crate, apron by garden door, rosemary, thyme, and sage beside path. Path divides at bakehouse and continues to orchard. Below that," she added, Bakehouse unchanged, oven cold and closed, bowls on shelves, table central, peel beside oven, door left ajar for closing round, walked only to first orchard row, meadow gate and drained race visible beyond wall. She paused, then recorded the states that mattered. Oak door and 4 main shutters open, 2 loft windows open, garden door open, stove low and steady, loft unchanged, 23 full sacks, 12 empty sacks, marker crate closed, sluice closed, supply race drained, wheel and gears stationary. Tessa read the entry once. It said what she had learned without pretending that she had prepared the bakehouse, tended the garden, cleared the orchard, or cleaned the main floor. Those tasks had not been needed. The rooms had simply become easier to hold in mind. She closed the notebook and slipped the pencil into its fold. The key remained beside it in its loose circle of leather. Through the doorway, the main floor looked much as it had before the round. Fine flour dust still rested harmlessly along the wall and beneath the workbench. The broom and dustpan remained beside the kitchen door. The 8 bin lids were closed. Light crossed the boards and stopped at the outer edge of the millstone frame. Above, cool air moved through the loft windows. Below, the shaft and gears rested in the wheel room. Nothing important had moved. Tessa stood and walked onto the main floor. She did not climb to the loft or descend the stone stairs. Both places had already been checked. She crossed the clear boards between the millstones and the workbench, then stepped through the open oak door. The cobbled yard held the last warmth of the afternoon. Deeper hollows between the stones showed a darker color where earlier moisture had lingered. Shadows from the alders moved whenever the leaves stirred. Tessa sat on the bench. From there she could see the water wheel resting against the brookside wall. Its wooden buckets were dark and still. The shallow water beneath it held no current. Beyond the channel, Alder Brook continued past the mill with its steady, ordinary sound. The gentle round was finished. Behind her, the mill remained open in its proper evening state. The kitchen, scullery, garden, bakehouse, and first orchard row now formed one simple route in her mind. She knew where the useful objects waited, but she had not taken them up. She knew what later work might involve, but she had not begun it early. The broom remained on its pegs. The garden remained untended. The bakehouse remained unprepared. The windfall apples remained beneath the trees. That was as it should be. There was still time before the final closing round for one short walk along the known orchard path, though there was no need to go beyond the first row or revisit the closed sluice. For the moment, Tessa rested on the bench with her hands loose in her lap. Alder leaves shifted above the footbridge. The light softened across the yard. The brook moved steadily past the quiet wheel, and every room behind her waited calmly in its place. Tessa remained on the bench in the yard for a little longer. The light had softened while she rested. It still reached the upper cobbles and the slate roof, but the shadows of the alders had lengthened across the yard. Beyond the mill wall, Alder Brook continued over its ordinary bed of stones, steady and unhurried. The wheel remained still. From the bench, Tessa could see the damp wooden buckets and the main shaft entering the wheel room. Only a shallow film of water lay in the channel beneath. It had no current. The sluice had already been confirmed during her first circuit. Its handle was down, the supply race was drained, and the natural brook passed the mill without entering the wheel channel. There was no reason to walk there again. Behind her, the mill stood open in the same settled state she had just recorded. The 4 main shutters and the 2 loft windows admitted the mild October air. The oak door rested against its stop. The garden door remained open beyond the kitchen and scullery. The stove held a low, steady warmth. At one end of the yard, the footbridge led toward the alder-lined lane. She already knew that route. It had brought her from the crossroads with her rucksack and satchel, and John Bell had used it when he left after giving her the key. At the other side of the building, the kitchen garden led toward the bakehouse and orchard. Tessa had walked only as far as the first row of trees during her gentle round. That was far enough. She could return by the same short way, bring the bakehouse door into its nighttime state, and settle indoors while the dusk deepened. Tessa stood. She crossed the main floor and followed the kitchen and scullery toward the garden. The air felt cooler beyond the stone threshold. Rosemary grew nearest the path, with thyme spread low beside it, and broad sage leaves showing pale among the weeds. Tessa drew her fingers gently along one rosemary stem. Its sharp, clean scent rose at once and remained on her fingertips. The beds did not need tending. A few late flowers had gone to seed, and dried lavender heads leaned over the stones near the bakehouse wall. One alder leaf lay across the path, where she had stepped around it earlier. Tessa left the leaf where it was. The bakehouse door remained ajar, exactly as she had left it. The wooden bar waited beside the frame. She passed the doorway without entering. The room had already been understood. The cold brick oven, the wooden peel, the bowls nested on their shelves, and the long pale table with its shallow worn place for kneading. Nothing inside required another inspection. The path curved around the low wall and entered the orchard. Long grass brushed softly against her boots. Apples lay beneath the trees in red, green, and muted gold. Some were firm and whole. Others had softened where they had fallen and rested low in the grass, returning slowly to the ground. Tessa walked no farther than the first row. From there, the route beyond was already clear. The orchard edge followed the low stone wall to the wooden gate. Beyond the gate lay the meadow, the empty supply race, and the narrow upstream path. She did not need to see the sluice itself to know where it stood, or how the water was passing. The broad orchard path was firm beneath her boots. The mill roof remained visible between the branches. Near the first tree, a small golden apple rested in a shallow cradle of grass. Its skin was unbroken, and no dark bruise showed where it had fallen. Tessa picked it up and turned it once in her hand. A dry blade of grass clung near the stem. She brushed it away with her thumb. The apple was smaller than the red one she had already set aside for morning, but sound enough to keep with it. She slipped the golden apple into her pocket. Its small weight settled against the cloth of her trousers. A breeze passed across the orchard. Leaves touched one another overhead, and the long grass leaned briefly in one direction before rising again. Beyond the wall, Alder Brook continued along its natural course. The stronger sound of water came from the brook, not from the drained race. The wheel remained still. Tessa looked back toward the mill. From the first row, the return was plain. Orchard to bakehouse to herb beds to scullery to kitchen. There was no need to make the route longer merely because some daylight remained. The orchard had given her its shape, its quiet air, and one sound apple. The meadow and sluice belonged to the circuit she had already completed. Tessa turned back. The path seemed shorter in return. The mill roof grew larger between the branches, followed by the upper stonework and the orchard side windows. Their open shutters held narrow panels of fading light. At the bakehouse she stopped. The door was still ajar. Tessa drew it closed with one hand. The wood met the frame without force. She lifted the plain wooden bar, settled it into the iron catch, and pressed the door once with her fingertips. It held securely. The bakehouse was closed for the night. Its oven remained cold, its table bare and its tools in place. No baking work had begun. Tessa continued into the garden. Rosemary scented the air again as she passed. Damp soil, old stone, dried lavender, and the faint sweetness of the apple in her pocket gathered into the cooler evening air. The pale path stones led directly to the open scullery door. The short return had been enough. First orchard row to bakehouse to garden to kitchen. No turn needed marking, no distance needed measuring. The route had become familiar by being followed gently, not by being repeated farther than necessary. At the scullery threshold, Tessa took the golden apple from her pocket. The skin held a little warmth where it had rested against her. A faint streak of dust remained near the stem, and one small spot of damp earth marked the underside. She carried it to the kitchen sink and rinsed it under the cold tap, turning it slowly in her hand. The dust and earth washed away. She dried the apple with a clean corner of a cloth and set it beside the notebook. The red apple from her first circuit remained there as well, still whole and ready for morning. Tessa placed the golden one beside it, without deciding which she would eat first. The stove held the same low warmth she had left behind. The kettle rested on the cooler iron. The notebook and key lay together on the table, with her satchel nearby where she had left it. Nothing indoors had changed during the short walk. There was still a little gentle work that suited the remaining light. Tessa returned to the main floor and took the broom from its pegs beside the kitchen door. The wooden-edged dustpan rested below it. She carried both to the workbench and began with the open boards along the wall. The flour dust moved easily. She drew the broom in short, quiet strokes, bringing the pale dust out of the shallow seams and away from the feet of the 8 bins. She did not try to scour every trace from the old oak. A little flour would always remain in the deepest lines of a mill floor. Her purpose was only to clear the walking space before the shutters were closed. The broom whispered beneath the workbench. Something narrow shifted against one of the rear legs. Tessa stopped, set the broom aside, and reached down. A short length of sound twine lay beneath the bench, lightly coated in flour dust. It was clean, unfrayed, and long enough to tie the neck of a sack. She ran it once between her fingers. There was no need to throw it away, and nothing needed tying now. Tessa placed the twine on the workbench, apart from the folded canvas sacks where it could be used later. Then she resumed sweeping. She worked around the millstone frame without touching the raised stone, its iron rods or the wooden wedges. The old number 7 marker no longer lay beneath the frame. It rested in the loft crate with the others, and the folded instruction remained above the straw. The dust gathered into a small pale line. Tessa swept it into the wooden-edged pan and carried it to the scullery. She set a sheet of scrap paper on the stone shelf, tipped the flour dust carefully into its center, and folded the paper inward from every side. When the pale dust was enclosed, she wrapped the little parcel once more and placed it at the far end of the shelf, away from the stove, ready to be carried outside with the household refuse later. The ash bucket beside the stove was only for ash that had been confirmed cold. Tessa left it untouched. A little flour remained on the dustpan's inner corner. She dampened a scrap of cloth at the sink and wiped the wood clean. After rinsing the cloth, she wrung it out and hung it from one of the empty scullery hooks beside the canvas apron. The nested buckets remained beneath the stone shelf. The folded cloths stayed in their low crate. The wrapped flour dust rested separately at the far end of the shelf. The rinsed scrap hung where moving air could dry it. Tessa returned the broom and dustpan to their pegs. The main floor looked no newer than before, which suited it. The boards were simply clear. 8 bin lids remained closed. The millstone stayed raised and motionless. The short length of twine rested on the workbench for another day. And the satchel remained safely in the kitchen. She did not descend to the wheel room or climb into the loft. The wheel and gears had already been confirmed stationary. The master switch remained untouched. Above, 23 full sacks stood tied against the walls. 12 empty sacks remained folded apart, and the marker crate was closed beneath the sloping roof. Nothing had happened that could have changed those states. Tessa carried the dustpan's cleaning cloth no farther, and moved no other object. The gentle work was complete. She returned to the kitchen and sat at the table. Beneath the record of her earlier round, she wrote, "Returned only to the first orchard row before dusk. Route through orchard edge, bakehouse path, garden, and scullery clear. Did not revisit meadow or sluice. Golden windfall apple brought in, washed, and set aside. Below that she added, bakehouse door barred, main floor walking space swept. Flower dust wrapped separately for later outdoor disposal. Ash bucket left for confirmed cold stove ash only. Broom and pan returned. Short length of sound twine found beneath workbench and left on bench for later use. Rinsed cloth drying on scullery hook. Then she recorded the unchanged states. Sluice closed. Supply race drained. Wheel and gears stationary. Oak door, 4 main shutters, 2 loft windows, and garden door still open. Stove low and steady. Tessa read the lines once, that was enough. The log existed to keep the mill's state clear, not to enlarge a simple walk, or make ordinary objects seem more important than they were. The twine was useful and explained by its place beneath the workbench. The apple was sound and ready for morning. The bakehouse was barred. The floor was clear. The swept flour dust was wrapped safely away from the stove and could be taken outdoors later. No question had been introduced. Tessa closed the notebook and slipped the pencil into its fold. The mill key lay within its loose circle of leather. The red and golden apples rested beside the cover. Her satchel remained nearby in the kitchen, where she had placed it earlier. She filled the kettle at the tap and returned it to the warmer part of the stove. While the water heated, she stood at the orchard window. Dusk gathered gently over the trees. The nearest branches were still distinct, but the farther rows had begun to soften together. The first orchard path remained faintly visible between the grass. Beyond it, hidden by trees and the low wall, the empty race continued through the meadow toward the closed sluice. Tessa did not need to see it again. The water stayed in the natural brook. The race stayed drained. The wheels stayed still. The brook sounded softly beyond the mill wall. The wheel gave no answer. When the kettle began to murmur, Tessa spooned tea into her cup and poured the water over it. Steam rose into the cooling kitchen air. She carried the cup to the table and sat beside the notebook, key, and apples. The return path was settled behind her. The orchard had led back to the bakehouse. The bakehouse path had led through the herb beds. The garden had led into the scullery, and the scullery had brought her to the warm center of the kitchen. No task had been left aside. The bakehouse was secured. The orchard gate remained as she had left it after her first circuit. The machinery had not been touched. The room beyond the kitchen waited with its floor clear, and its shutters still open to the last of the evening. Tessa held the warm cup between her hands, while the remaining daylight drained from the window. After tea, the closing round would begin in the familiar order she had already written. Garden door, stove, main floor, wheel room, loft windows, shutters, and oak door. For now there was no need to begin early. The kettle settled on the stove. The apples rested beside the notebook. The key remained within reach. Alder Brook moved beyond the wall, and every open part of the mill waited calmly for night. The last daylight drained from the kitchen window, while Tessa finished her tea. The orchard softened from rows of trees into dark shapes against the grass. Beyond them, the alders became one uneven line, and the pale strip of sky above the branches deepened from gray to blue. When the cup was empty, she carried it to the sink, rinsed it, and left it upside down on the draining board. The red apple from her first circuit and the smaller golden apple from her later walk remained beside the notebook. The golden apple had been washed, and the red apple had simply been set aside for morning. The mill was still open in its evening order. 4 main shutters and 2 loft windows stood open. The oak door rested against its stop, and the garden door remained open beyond the scullery. The bakehouse was already barred. The orchard path lay quiet in the dusk. The stove held a low, steady warmth. Now the closing round could begin. Tessa struck a match and lit the lamp above the table. The flame caught the wick, rose briefly, and steadied beneath the glass. Warm light spread across the worn wood, the closed notebook, the mill key on its leather thong, and the 2 apples. The rest of the kitchen remained in gentle shadow. She slipped the key over her wrist, picked up the lamp, and crossed the scullery. Before closing the garden door, she looked along the path. Rosemary gave off a faint, clean scent beside the stones. Beyond the herb beds, the bakehouse stood dark and secure, its wooden bar seated in the iron catch exactly as she had left it. She did not walk out to test it again. The oven inside was cold and closed. The peel, bowls, and kneading table were all settled. Farther away, the orchard had nearly disappeared into the evening. The small gate stood at the meadow wall beyond the trees. Past it, the sluice handle was down. The sluice was closed, and Alder Brook continued through its natural bed. One walk had been enough. Tessa drew the garden door shut. The key, already in its lock, turned easily. She tested the handle once, then carried the lamp into the kitchen. The stove had burned down to a bed of quiet coals. Their red glow showed around the firebox door. Tessa moved the kettle to the cooler iron and drew the damper until the draft softened. The lever made a low scrape. Behind the closed door, the glow settled into a deeper, steadier color. She added no more wood. The kitchen was warm enough, and the remaining coals would give up their heat slowly. The tap was closed. The tea tin was covered. The matches were dry on the shelf. The clean cup rested evenly on the draining board. The apples and notebook could remain on the table. Tessa carried the lamp onto the main floor. The light from the open windows was now scarcely brighter than the room itself. The millstones occupied the center of the floor, their gray surfaces pale at the edge of the lamp's circle. The upper stone remained slightly raised in its wooden frame, held by the same iron rods and wooden wedges. Nothing in the mechanism had moved. She began with the bins. Each lid lay flat. Tessa passed her hand lightly across them in order, feeling the smooth, worn boards beneath her palm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All were closed, all had been empty, clean and dry when she checked them. There was no need to lift the lids again. At number 7 she paused for no longer than a breath. Its wooden marker rested in the crate above with the others. John Bell had identified it when she arrived, and the folded instruction in the crate had confirmed its ordinary use. The number matched the bin. The crossed circle was the Bell and Son mill mark. When an empty sack returned, its marker returned to the box. The marker had its purpose and its place. Nothing about it waited to be solved. The main floor boards had been swept. The broom and dustpan had been returned beside the kitchen door. The short length of sound twine found beneath the workbench rested on the bench for later use, and Tessa's satchel had been brought inside from the yard. The folded canvas sacks remained stacked at one end of the workbench. Her rucksack stood near the loft ladder, where she had placed it after her first walk through the orchard. No loose object lay beneath the millstone frame. A little flower dust remained harmlessly in the deepest seams of the oak and at the room's edges, but the walking space was clear. Tessa went to the stone stairs and descended into the wheel room, holding the lamp well away from the timber. Cool air met her at the bottom. The main shaft rested in its iron brackets. The wooden gear teeth fitted into one another without movement, and the master switch remained untouched inside its closed box. She stood on the landing and listened. Alder Brook could be heard beyond the wall, steady in its natural course. The sound passed faintly through stone and timber, but the mechanism contributed no sound of its own. Beneath the wheel, the channel held only its shallow, motionless film of water among the stones. The distinction remained plain. The brook moved. The wheel rested. Tessa raised the lamp slightly. Its light passed over the nearest gear, the iron brackets, and the edge of the channel. Everything remained in the position she knew. The closed sluice kept the water in the brook. The supply race was drained. Nothing reached the wheel, and no part of the machinery had begun to turn. One confirmation was enough. She climbed back to the main floor without touching the switch, shaft, gears, or wheel. The loft came next. Tessa set the lamp on the workbench, raised the trapdoor, and climbed with both hands free. At the top, she lifted the lamp after her and placed it safely on the floorboards. The two gable windows were still open. Cool air moved through the loft, carrying damp leaves from the lane side and the faint sweetness of apples from the orchard side. Beneath those scents remained the warmer smell of canvas, old timber, and dry grain. She crossed first to the orchard window. The garden and trees had nearly disappeared, but she could still make out the lighter line of the path. Somewhere beyond the orchard wall stood the small gate into the meadow. Beyond it, the empty race followed the grass upstream to the closed sluice. No water ran along it toward the mill. Tessa drew the window inward and fastened the latch. At the opposite gable, the lane was hidden beneath the alders. The footbridge and cobbled yard lay below the angle of the roof, known even when they could not be seen. She closed that window too, and pressed the latch into place. The loft became still. The brook remained audible, though the closed glass softened its voice. 23 full sacks stood against the walls, their tied necks leaning at familiar angles. 12 empty sacks remained folded apart from them. Tessa followed the rows with her eyes. 23 full, 12 empty. The numbers were unchanged. The marker crate rested beneath the sloping roof, tucked between the last sack and the wall. Its lid was closed. The folded instruction lay inside above the straw where Tessa had returned it. The markers were together beneath it, number 7 among them. She did not draw the crate forward. Its order was complete. The cot stood beneath the roof slope. The brown blanket lay across it, with one corner folded back, and the pillow rested flat against the wall. Her rucksack remained downstairs near the loft ladder. She could bring it up when she was ready to leave the kitchen. The cot itself required no further preparation. Tessa carried the lamp down, lowered the trapdoor gently, and let it settle flush with the ceiling. Only the main shutters and the oak door remained open. She began on the orchard side. At the first window, she pulled the shutters inward until the wood met the stone sill, then lowered the iron latch. The second pair closed with a mild creak from one hinge. Across the room, she closed the first yardside shutters. The lamplight became warmer as the outside dusk was covered. The bins and millstone frame drew nearer within its circle, while the corners softened into shadow. At the final window, she paused. The cobbled yard lay dim beyond the glass. The bench stood against the wall, empty. Past it, the pale handrail of the footbridge showed faintly between the alders. At the edge of the view, the water wheel rested against the mill wall, its buckets dark with old moisture and evening air. Nothing moved in the wheel channel. The sound beyond it came from Alder Brook, continuing past the mill along its natural bed. Tessa closed the last shutters and fitted the latch. The main floor now held only lamplight. She walked around the millstone frame at an easy distance. The rods and wedges remained settled. The raised stone was cool and still. The swept floor held no misplaced object. The closed bins, workbench, broom, dustpan, trapdoor, stairs, and shutters were all as they should be. At the entrance, Tessa stood within the open oak doorway and looked out once. The air in the yard was cooler than it had been during her walk. Nothing remained on the bench. Beyond it, the footbridge led toward the lane beneath the alders. She knew that route without needing to follow it. Bridge, lane, and crossroads. Behind the mill, the other return path was equally plain. Orchard edge, bakehouse path, kitchen garden, scullery and kitchen. Both outward paths had brought her back. Tessa drew the heavy oak door shut and turned the mill key. The lock resisted at the beginning of the turn and then moved firmly. The bolt entered the frame with a deep settled sound. She tested the handle once. The mill was closed for the night. There would be no second passage through the rooms, no later visit to the yard, and no more opening of a door, shutter, or window. Tessa returned to the kitchen and set the lamp on the table. She slipped the key from her wrist and laid it beside the notebook. The stove gave a soft click as the iron cooled. Through the walls came the low, continuous sound of the brook. She opened the notebook beneath the earlier entries and wrote a few plain lines. Bakehouse barred. Garden door locked. Stove damped. Bins and workbench settled. Swept floor clear. Broom and pan returned. Wheel and gears stationary. Switch untouched. 23 full sacks and 12 empty sacks unchanged. Marker crate closed. Loft windows and main shutters fastened. Oak door locked. Below that she added sluice closed. Supply race drained. Wheel still. Closing round complete. She read the lines once. The page held the evening without adding anything that had not happened. The marker instruction had been read and returned above the straw. The main floor had been swept. The kitchen, scullery, garden, bakehouse, orchard, meadow path, wheelroom, loft, yard, footbridge, and lane had all found their practical places in her mind. The sluice was closed. The race was drained. The wheel was still. Every door that needed closing was closed. Every shutter and window that had aired the mill was fastened. The stove was damped. The kettle was cooling. And the machinery remained untouched. Tessa laid the pencil across the page and closed the notebook around it. The 2 apples stayed beside the cover, ready for morning. The key rested within its loose circle of leather. There was nothing else to record. She remained at the kitchen table. Her hands rested around the empty place where the teacup had stood. The wood was smooth in the center and cooler near the edges. A shallow scratch ran beside her little finger, old enough that its corners had worn soft. The table carried mild warmth from the stove on one side, and the cooler night from the window on the other. The stove clicked again. Tessa looked at the firebox. The coals were low and even. She did not open the door or alter the damper. The fire was already doing what it needed to do, giving up its last warmth gradually. The lamp flame remained steady. Its light touched the red apple, the golden apple, the notebook, and the leather thong of the key. Beyond that small circle, the sink, cupboards, and closed scullery door rested in shadow. Tessa listened without searching for any particular sound. There was the quiet cooling of iron. There was the faint settling of old wood. There was Alder Brook beyond the stone wall, moving along its ordinary course. The iron cooled a little. The wood settled a little. The brook went on moving. No shaft turned beneath the main floor. No wooden gear tooth rose to meet the next. No water entered the wheel channel. The wheel rested beside the moving brook, and the mill held the difference between those 2 states without effort. Warmth remained around Tessa's boots and along the side of the table nearest the stove. The air above the stone floor had begun to cool, but slowly. The kitchen kept the day's mild heat in its wood, iron, and stone. The lamplight softened the apple's skins. Their stems cast short shadows across the table. The notebook cover lay flat beside them. The key was safe. Nothing on the table needed to be moved. The apples could wait. The notebook could stay closed. The key could remain where her hand would find it. The room eased from evening warmth toward night warmth. Alder Brook continued beyond the wall, its separate ripples and turns joining into one low, even passage. Tessa knew the rooms around her without looking at them. Beyond the doorway, the 8 bins stood closed. The millstones remained raised and still at the center of the clear floor. Above them, the full sacks held their settled weight, and the empty sacks remained folded apart. Below, the shaft rested in its brackets, and the gear teeth rested together. Her rucksack waited near the ladder. It could stay there until she rose. Nothing inside it was needed while she remained at the table, and carrying it upstairs would be the last simple movement between the warm kitchen and the prepared cot. She did not go to see any of the rooms again. The log was written. The closing round was complete, the sluice was closed, the supply race was drained, the wheel was still. Those facts could remain where she had left them, settled in wood, stone, canvas, iron, and ink. The draining board held the clean cup upside down. The kettle cooled on the quieter iron. The stove cooled behind its closed door. The lamp held its small circle over the table. Tessa's shoulders lowered. Her palms rested lightly on the wood, no longer holding a cup, pencil, key, or lamp. There was no object left in her hands and no next item waiting in the round. Warm wood beneath her palms, lamplight across the table, cooling iron beside her, moving water beyond the wall, resting timber beneath the main floor. Outside, the orchard had disappeared into night. The apples beneath the branches could lie where they had fallen. The small gate stood at the meadow wall. Beyond it, the empty race lay quiet. The closed sluice kept the water in the brook's natural bed. Inside, Tessa stayed where the light already was. The stove clicked once more, then became quiet. Old wood answered later with a faint sound beyond the kitchen doorway, only the building settling as its warmth changed. After that came the brook again, not beginning because it had never stopped, simply becoming the clearest sound in the room. The brook moved past the mill. The wheel rested beside it. Again the water passed over its ordinary stones. Again the mill remained still. Again the lamp touched the apples, notebook and key with the same amber light. Nothing waited to be explained. Nothing needed to be checked again. The evening had been entered in the log, the building had been closed, and both known paths had returned to this warm kitchen. The prepared cot waited above, but there was no need to rise yet. When she was ready, Tessa could take the rucksack from beside the ladder and carry it up with her. Until then, she could remain beside the fading stove and listen to the brook. The closed rooms required nothing from her. The apples required nothing. The key and notebook could rest together through the quiet hours. She stayed at the table while night settled fully around the mill. The wood beneath her hands held its warmth. The flame beneath the glass remained steady. The last heat left the stove slowly. Alder Brook moved beyond the wall, and beside it, closed, quiet, and completely at rest, the wheel remained still.